Okay, let's pretend that never happened. Like that time at band camp. So, where were we? Let's just scrap all of this and start again. It's easy enough to do. So what we were doing, blah de blah, get rid of that, don't need it. Right, so what we were doing, we're looking at continuing with Studio Beta and importing a furniture item with custom poses. So essentially what we're doing this time is testing the skeletons and the action creation in Studio. Just to recap before we do that though, yesterday we were looking at how we can test these items that we're creating in Studio Beta. They do load in IMVU Classic, but they don't have obviously the normal map and the shininess map. And in IMVU Desktop, let's see if that will actually start this time. Yes, it does. It may boot me out. No, it hasn't. So in IMVU Desktop, we can look at the items in our inventory, but they don't appear on the avatar. No, this is accessories for the gold bars. So we should have the gold bars appearing in the avatar's hand, but they don't. So we can play around with Studio Beta, but we can't really do anything with it beyond publishing and going through that process. So we can't actually see the items in IMVU. So exit that because it's using up too many resources. And we can exit from this as well for now. No, don't want to save that. So what we're going to do is create a furniture item from these gold blocks that we created the other day, and we're going to add some custom poses to them. So this is what we had in Blender. Oh, let's open the original version before we mucked around with it. Gold bar pile. So that's what we had from yesterday. And just to recap, we created our original gold bar or gold ingot, and then just to get the pile we just duplicated them and repositioned them and then joined them together to form a single object. So that is now a single unified object, which is then parented to the root node of the furniture item. This is the furniture starter file. So we parent the two together so we can export it as a unit, and that can then be imported into Studio as a furniture item. So there's the avatar, and there is our furniture item. And it's got all the normal map and the shininess map. What we can do now to this is add a couple of seat node spots or seat spots. We can use both the standing and the sitting, or the sitting and the standing, because it doesn't matter what pose set we use, because we're creating custom poses, and all we're doing is using these node sets as reference points for what we want to create when we create our custom poses. So all we need to do is just position them roughly where we need them to be. So we do that by grabbing the seat node and moving that. Don't need to select the other nodes that are associated with the seat because they're attached to it. So just grab the seat node, and then what we need to do is parent these. Whoops. So shift click select. We need to parent all of these nodes to the root node. So we select that last, and then from the object menu, object, parent, and then object. And that'll bring up the pop-up. Make sure that object is selected and that keep transform is enabled, because as we can see, the nodes have been repositioned all over the place. So we want to keep their original position, like so. No thanks, Chiang. So once we've got this, and it's now controlled by the root bone, that was someone posting a link in chat. That's totally unnecessary. Once we've got that, we can save it. Save as pile 2, and we'll just save over the top of the one that we created earlier that we don't need anymore, because what we're going to do is open up the pose file. We can use the alternative pose file or the standard pose file, it doesn't matter, the older one. And what we need is the gold bar mesh, a root node for the furniture item, and the 2 large seat nodes, which will be reference points for our poses. So we're going to append those into that file. So just save over that just for the sake of doing it. Then file, new, so we reset, and then we want to open the pose file. I'm going to use the alternative pose file for this because it makes it easier to see what's going on. So there's the alternative pose file, and then open. So that's what we've got. And has it done its thing? Yes, it has. So there's a problem with Blender 2.8.2 and probably above, so the next version will probably carry on with this problem, that the starter files created with 2.80, there's something in those files that Blender 2.82 does not like, and it's the same with the Blender 2.81 files as well. So 8.0 and 8.1 cause problems for 8.2. So what we have to do is reset Blender, so that's just new general, open, select the file again, and this time we need to click that cog icon and disable load UI. We disable that and then open. We now have to reset the view because IMVU's scale is much larger than Blender's. So the scale is 100, that's the viewport display. And then in the sidebar, we want to set end clipping to 5000, clip start to 1. And that gets us our basic scene reset. So what we can do before doing anything is save this, save as, gold bar poses, and that'll override the one that we created earlier, which we can do, because we shall not talk about that ever again. Save as. Right, so we need to append the objects. Append, and this makes the files behave like a zip file or a zip archive. So if we select our blend file, double click, we can see its contents, and we want object. So double click that, get all our objects, and we want to select gold low, hold control, and we want root, then seat 01 sitting and seat 02 standing, and then append. There are our objects. And what we want to do with this to create our custom poses is, it should still be moving as a unit. Yes, it is. But what we want to do is use the seat nodes as reference points for our pose and how the avatar is then posed relative to our gold block furniture item. And to do that, we need to select our furniture, and we can either, because they're all grouped together as a unit, we can select the root node and just move everything. But what we want to be doing is going to wireframe. What we want to be doing, and this is where we might need to select everything so we can see the origin point of the seat node, because we need to align that to Blender's grid center, which is basically at the feet or the root of the avatar for the pose that we're going to create. So we can create our pose. What we need to do actually, because we reset the view, change the timeline, which is this window at the bottom. We need to change that to, dope sheet, and then change the dope sheet to the action editor. So we'll click on that and then click on action editor. We can expand this a little bit. Now to create our pose, all we need to do, so one of these is in transparency for some peculiar reason. There we go. There's a bug with the display options if X-ray is enabled. It makes the avatar, well, the avatar of the objects appear odd. So we just have to be careful with that. Right, so let's make our pose. What we're going to do, let's do a seated one. We can use the rotate widget for the most part, or the transform widget, which includes, that's one thing we have to keep in mind, is when we select multiple bones and want to manipulate them, we generally will have to be in global mode. Otherwise, we'll end up deforming the not deforming, will reposition the bones relative to their orientation. So in global, we can select both bones and manipulate the mesh in the same direction, but in local, oh, I didn't do it, it's the hips that does that. Because the hips are mirrored, they rotate in opposite directions. So what we're going to do is a sitting pose. So we're using the standing seat node set for this, but we are creating a seated pose. So it doesn't matter what the seat node sets that you use are. All that matters is that they form a reference point for the pose that you want to create. Which is what you lock onto in IMVU. So let's go with local, so that we have local control over the bones. And unlike the clothing file, which we were looking at earlier in the week, we can't manipulate a chain of bones. We have to manipulate individual bones. Whoops, that's the wrist, don't want that. So that's the clavicle. And what this will do is drop. So we need to check the position relative to the ground. So viewpoint, front or right, doesn't really matter. And this is all it means to, this is all that's necessary rather for a pose. butt's a bit far off the ground, so let's move it a bit closer. Adjust the thigh bone. And that is pose 1. So rename goalbar1.pose. Then to create a new one, so that's the first pose. Let's double check that it's going to insert a keyframe for all of them. So this is just the initial pose. This isn't what we're going to be necessarily doing for IMVU, in the sense that because IMVU, oops, that's a bit wonky. IMVU needs something. The file needs to be set up for IMVU to be usable in IMVU. So we have to prep the file for IMVU. So what we've got is our basic pose, but we have to prep it later on. So just double check our bones have added a keyframe. Disable or deactivate this button, and that will show all the bones that are related to that pose. So if we enable that, all we see is the bone that's selected. So that entry changes depending on the bone that's selected. So if you want to see all of them, just disable this icon. It'll show all the bones. So select all, and then pose, animation wherever it's gone. There it is, animation, insert keyframe. We'll get the pop-up. We want lock rot, so that's location rotation. We can't use scale. Alternatively, just press the I key, I for insert, and we get the same menu, lock rot. So that's our first pose. So we want to duplicate this to create a new pose. So we just click on this file icon and it'll duplicate this pose and append .001, and we can get rid of that. So click delete, just call this pose 2. Click the shield icon. That creates a fake user, so the data is kept in the Blender file. So double check. We have a little F that appears before our file name, and that verifies that the fake user is created. That's what the F stands for, fake user. So what we can do with this now is create a second pose. So we need to adjust the position of our furniture item objects, and we need to select our seat, oh well, the second node or the first node, depending on the order of the nodes, but we want to rotate that round, viewport top, wireframe so that we can see. And then just move that into position again. Add good center. So that now puts the avatar in relation to the furniture item quite a distance away ordinarily, but because we're creating a custom pose, it doesn't really matter. So what we can do with this, it's a second pose, remember, so we can select everything, select all, and we can reset this. So clear transform all, and it resets our pose or the avatar. So we can repose it. Whoops. So when you're wanting to move the avatar, don't use female 03 master root. That must stay in position. If the avatar has to be repositioned or change its location, if it's walking, sitting, it doesn't matter, use pelvis node. Move that instead. And this is because female 03 master root is the bone that IMVU uses as the root element of the avatar. It's the thing that it uses to locate the avatar in 3D space. So if you're moving, don't use that. Use pelvis node. So what we're going to do with this then, let's get the avatar lying on its front. Lying on its stomach, or maybe its side. With its arms wrapped. Let's see if this doesn't distort the mesh too much. With its arms wrapped around the gold and the head buried in it. Like so. But we've got to be careful because we're starting to pinch the shoulders. So let's see if I can change the appearance. Let me exit out of that for the moment. Oh no, because we're using mesh proxies, so we can't do that. Okay, so that has to stay that way. That's a little annoying, but we can work with it. So they've got the head. Be careful with the neck bones. So this is a little tricky because we don't want to manipulate the neck bones too much because they go a little funky. So there's one hand. Or one arm. Here's the other one. try not to bend or use the bicep as the rotational bone for the arm, for the upper arm. I want to try and leave that for the shoulder bone, which is this tiny cube. It's both, same on both sides. That should be your point of rotation for the most part. So then the legs. Front side view. Whoops. Whoops. Somebody likes their gold bullion. I wonder if, let's see what. Reset that bone. It's twisted a little bit too much, so clear transform. So there's our second pose. Double check, select all, again pose, animation, insert keyframe, lock rot. So we now have two poses. So we can toggle between these two. It obviously doesn't move our objects because they are not associated with the pose itself, because this is literally just the pose file. So again, we load in our reference objects, which are the furniture item, mesh, the root node, and the seat nodes. Those are our reference objects around which we then create our pose. So we can toggle between the two of them without necessarily changing the object position. We can do that by creating an animation sequence for these two, for these objects, but it's not necessary. So those are our two poses. Let's save the file we have done. So let's save a version, save as. Now to prep these for use in IMVU, we have to do something to the sequence. So if we export these as they currently are, IMVU will ignore the pose. It'll think that the file is empty because for whatever reason, if it doesn't see any changes to the coordinates that are associated with each bone, it thinks that nothing is happening in the file. So we have to force it to think that there is something in the file, and we do that by selecting everything, select all, moving the timeline slider to another key frame in the timeline, so 5 for this in this example. And then what we can do is, well, actually what we should do is select everything, so select all, and then copy. Where's the copy thing gone? Copy pose, move the timeline, so copy, then move, and pose, paste, and it'll duplicate the pose data across those two frame keys, keyframes. Move it to frame 10, doesn't have to be 10, but just another frame. And then what we need to do is reset. So select everything, pose, clear transform all, and that resets the pose. And we need this. So this change forces IMVU to read the data that's included in the FBX file. We have to do that for both of them. And this is necessary in order to get a static pose out of Blender and into IMVU. Let's do the same thing for gold bar 1. So move our timeline back to 1, select all, copy the pose, move the slider to frame 5, paste the pose, so we've duplicated it, and then to frame 10 and clear it, clear transform all. So we now have two poses, and this is incidentally the principle of creating animated poses. What you're doing is essentially the same sort of thing. You're creating a series of static poses at different frames of the timeline, and then Blender and IMVU do the rest and create the movement that occurs between those keyframes, and that essentially creates our animation. But we're just doing static poses, so again this is necessary prep to get these out of Blender and into IMVU. Right, so save this again, and then we can export this. So exit pose mode, keep the armature selected, file, export, FBX. We want selected objects. Everything else is okay there. Geometry, that's okay. Armature, always disable add leaf bones. And then for bake animation, because we're exporting animation, we need to disable NLA strips and force start end keying. So disable those two. File name, that's okay. File location, that's okay. So double check. Selected objects, modifiers, disable, export. So that's the poses. Reset the file, reset Blender rather, back into our furniture item, gold pile 2. So for this, we need to create, well, it's not create, we need to let IMVU know that these seat nodes, or these pose spots, are going to be custom poses. And we do that by changing their file name. So double click, this can be done in object data properties, not object data properties, object properties. So that's this button. And then we just click and type, or we double click in the outliner, do the same thing. What we do is gold bar, that was pose 1, gold bar 1, select the sitting one, do the same thing, gold bar 2. We don't have to do anything to the others. And the append, gold bar, is uppercase G. What we should be able to do now is save, not save, well actually yes, let's save this, save as number 3. Then we can export this. So select the nodes, mesh, and then the root node. The root node generally wants to be the last object selected, so it highlights a slightly brighter orange. And then File, Export, FBX. And for this, we want selected objects again. So selected objects. Everything else is okay. Geometry, that's okay. Armature, disable, add leaf bones. We don't need any animation for this, so we can disable that as well. File name is okay. Export FBX. So we now have 2 FBX files. So this bit is going to be interesting. So what we have to do now is create a new project. So we want furniture item, empty furniture, derive, so that's the empty scene. So we need to edit, import our FBXs. So furniture, gold pile 3, open. It should be noted as well that Studio currently uses up quite a lot of resources relative to Classic Editor. So that's something to be aware of. If you are using an older machine, and by older we're talking below second or third generation, maybe even fourth generation Intel CPUs, then it may cause problems. So keep that in mind. So setup FBX, scale 0.01, ten bones, one mesh, and remember, as was discussed yesterday, so let's have a look at this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the FBX itself is 10. So these objects are separate, they're not an actual armature, but within the confines of an FBX they form a hierarchical structure that the FBX interprets as a skeleton. So although there are no armature objects in the scene, we do have a skeleton of sorts, which is why we have 10 bones and one mesh listed as our skeletal structure in IMVU. So it's got our mesh. Next, brick texture. No animation for this. Review, that's okay, and then import. So we need to preview, and again, as been discussed the past couple of days, there may be a delay when doing this because IMVU is sending the data back and forth between it and you. Right, so no normal maps, so we have to go into component, just toggle between these to get it into gear. Normal map, add. Where's our normal map gone? Oh, we're in accessories. Accessories. Normal map. Number 4. So that's assigned it to the slot. Do the same thing for shininess. Whoops. That one. And that's assigned it to the slot. And we can close those and preview. And again, as been discussed, it keeps resetting the view, so you have to keep scrolling back in and out. But anywho, that is our normal map and shininess map assigned to our gold ingots. So that works. So let's just save this file, save as. Gold bar plus poses. Save. So it hasn't. So where are our okay, so need to import the second FBX. Edit, import. Furniture, blended 2.8, gold bar poses, open. So let's see what this does. One skeleton, 0 meshes, 4 animations. So we need to change the scale again, 0.01. We don't need, no we do, 87 bones. So in this instance, because we're importing just pose data, so there's no meshes or anything, we need to deselect. This operates slightly differently from the way that Classic Editor does. So we need to uncheck that to unhide the skeleton that we need, so that there is a skeleton associated with the animations that we're going to bring in. Otherwise it balks out. So next, no materials. So there are our meshes, not meshes, animations. So we don't want these two, which are two test sequences. Gold bar 2, gold bar 1. Review, import. Right, so that's in the assets, we now have the furniture route and then the animation sequences. So it's listing our two FBX data structures. Whoops. So that's 1 up to there. Whoops. That's 1 and then that's 2. So in component, let's see what we've got. Right, okay, so as with Classic, which is not open, as with Classic, because we've imported another file over the top of another file, we have to make sure that we're using the right furniture armature. So skeletons, select the skeleton that's associated with the furniture item, and then we have to select the asset that's associated with that. At the moment it's listing the pose skeleton, but we want the furniture node, the furniture skeleton, which is root node underscore root. Just preview that to set it in place. Resets the view. So we should have, there we have our two blank pose spots. So that was the sitting one. So relative to gold blocks, that was the sitting one. Where's the other one gone? And that's the standing one. So we want to create some actions. So there we have our two actions. So ensemble, so I've not done this before, so this is all new. Asset. So which pose are we on? So gold bar 2. So that's pose 2. So the duration, right, so duration 0 is infinite. We want our frames, so in this case it's frame 1 to frame 2. Don't need any blend, we want to replace. No morph animation, so we don't need any of that. So double check. Whoops, that's the asset. So that's the XAF, that's the XAF. Speed is 100, which is the default. Duration. Oh no, so they've changed the order of those. So look, we've got start, end, and then loops. So we need to change that to start 1, end 2, and then the loops is 0. No blend, and then apply. So let's preview that, see what that does. Nothing yet. Doesn't look as if they may have. So go bar 1, do the same thing again, ensembles, asset, pose 1. So start at frame 1, end at frame 2, number of loops is 0. Replace, apply. Just set that in place. So now they need to change this, because this is where we type the trigger. So that's stance dot now. Do we do idle? Because the setup of this differs slightly to classic. Uh-oh. I remember that problem from a long, long time ago. So they haven't got the poses sorted out. Or is it gold bar 2? That would be stance dot gold bar 1. May have to open the classic editor and take a look. Never remember how to set up the triggers. Oh, there we go. Whoops-a-daisy. So there are 2 poses, so yes. So the first one's worked. Well, they both work, it's just that number 2 is in a really odd position. So we need to do a little bit of work with the positions of some of the bones, but that has worked. It's brought in our pose for both seat spots. Yeah, so we need to do a bit of work on that. So it's just a question of tweaking the bone positions. But what we may need to do, want to do, do the same thing in Classic just to see what it does with the same files. So this will that's fine. So 0.01. For furniture it's 0. Import. It's interesting that specular factor is not supported, not a supported use for texture maps. That's fine. Import changes. So it's brought that in. So it's interesting that it recognizes a specular map. So there are our two poses. So let's bring in the second file. File contains no meshes, which is fine. Import changes 0.01. Don't need these two. And import. Apply changes. And again, it resets the furniture item, so we have to select proper thingamajiggery. And then set up our actions. So stance dot gold bar 1 avatar, same ensemble, gold bar 1, replace number of loops 0, loop start 1, end 2. We don't need anything else. Apply changes. Stance dot gold bar 2 avatar, same ensemble, pose number 2, replace loops 0, loop start 1, end 2. Everything else is okay. Apply changes, and let's see what that does. Aha! So it's a problem. It's a problem. There we go. Gimme, gimme. It's a problem with Studio. So let's just save this. Save as gold bar plus poses. So it works. So that's our furniture item. But in Classic, not Classic, in Studio, the pose data is a little wonky. But it does work. So whether 3D Studio Max users have the same sort of issues will be interesting to see. So any Max users that use Studio Beta, it'll be interesting to see what problems they encounter. But that is a furniture item with 2 custom poses. Although it shouldn't look like that, it should look like that. Whoops. So Studio on the left versus Classic on the right. And that was it for today, really. It was just testing to see how IMVU Studio's capabilities with poses. It works, but they're a little out of sync. So let's just save this. Save. Oh, come on. Save as. Plus poses 2. Let's just double check something. Close. Close. Because it could be just something related to caching of data, local caching of data. And it is. That is so bizarre. Don't know why it does that. So if you're working, this is just a general thing. Oh, the arm's gone a bit wonky, so may need to just double check those anyway. So if you're working with IMVU, creating a project, and whatever it is that you've brought in imports and is wonky for some reason, save the project. This goes for both, I guess, but save the project, close everything, including the Create tab, and then reopen and reload the project, because for some reason it must be something to do with the way that IMVU caches, creates a temporary copy of the data that you are editing, the way that it caches that data locally as you are working on the project, that somehow breaks or malforms. And you should find that the project, or whatever it is that you were doing, reopens and appears as you expected it to. So there is some weirdness going on there. Might need to check that hand clipping. But the issue now is, so the two poses, it's brought in the poses, but the problem now is, well, it looks okay in Classic with some minor tweaks here and there, but in Studio it's essentially, the arms need a lot more adjustment, and the position of the avatar, in fact, actually relative to the... So do you then correct the problem in Blender or 3D Studio Max relative to what you're seeing in Studio, or do you correct it relative to what you're seeing in Classic? Because you can bet your bottom dollar that the Classic version will appear correctly in IMVU Classic and the new IMVU desktop beta, whereas the one that's adjusted for Studio, would that necessarily then appear correct in Classic? So there is a bit of an issue there that needs to be addressed. So where is the problem? Where is the error in these two data sets? Is it in Classic or is it in Studio? So again, it's worth playing around with Studio just to get familiar with it, because this is going to be what's used going forward. So at some point in the future, at some point this year, I guess, later this year, Studio Beta will be released in a more fully capable than it currently is. So it's probably worth getting familiar with it. But at the moment, it doesn't look as if... Well, it's still buggy, basically. So if you're doing stuff to get it into the catalog, just use Classic and just play around with Studio. Because at least you know that way your items will work in all the Classic apps. But with that said, the normal maps and the shininess maps do look quite nice. They do add quite a bit of interest to the objects. And this is with, well, we used a 512 by 256, but we don't have to use images that large. This would be fine with a 256 by 128, so essentially a quarter of the size. So, what I'll do is IMVU so this is where you get, well, this is the forum for beta. And this is where you download it. Copy, paste. And this'll probably be the last video, last stream looking at Studio Beta, because it's not stable enough to be used for publishing products. So the next videos will likely be just backing Classic and just making projects using Classic. But as features are discovered or included with Studio, we'll do a stream on that and maybe just focus on those elements and discoveries that occur. But that's it for today. Sorry about earlier. It never happened, just like that time at Bandcamp. And right, yes, we'll see you on the next stream. So thanks for lurking, lurkers, and we'll see you anon. Bye for now.